Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vickie Lan, and in each episode, I and a guest will unpack a trope with an eye for world building, character development, or narrative structures. You can also join the conversation on TikTok and Instagram. For those times when the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. All right, Damien, if there is a silly experience that you've had in your childhood that would inform your villain origin story, what would it be? And to give you some time to think about it, I'm gonna give you my example. When I was in seventh grade social studies class, my teacher gave us instructions to do a group project, and when she said, "All right, go," I was so excited that I tried to get up real fast from my seat. My foot got caught in the tangle of desks, and I flew across the aisle, landed on the ground, and the entire classroom laughed at me, including my friend who I thought was my friend, was the loudest, and I was so embarrassed.
Horrified, I'm guessing, right?
Yeah, so horrified. And I think if I had to have a moment in my childhood that would determine my villain origin story, that would probably be it. So what's yours?
Why that one though? Why specifically that one?
I think number one, it was like the mass level of embarrassment. I've fallen before. I used to perform on stage. It's not like unheard of to like have little trip ups. But I think because it was so unexpected, it was like a jolt for me. It hurt, secondly. And third, I think it was the betrayal of that one friend who wasn't just laughing jovially, like literally finger pointed in my face, ha ha ha. And she and I aren't really friends anymore because that fell apart. But like, yeah, that's probably why.
Did it fall apart at that moment, or did you give some grace and
There was
you know?
there was some grace. I think that was a hint though that maybe our personality styles were a little different. Eventually we kind of had a falling out over time, but yeah. And I'm
Spoiler,
all
well,
for laughing at myself. I laugh at myself all the time, but that particular one I think was a little bit more was humiliating.
yeah, I could see that. So along those same lines, it's funny that you bring up that story. And I don't know why my mind just automatically went to this moment, but I distinctly remember it was the last day of fifth grade, and I'm walking home from school, and it's just me by myself. And there was a huge hill to go from the school down to the block of where I lived. And along this hill, there was this like giant wall that was, stepped up a little bit, mostly to keep the dirt and the actual hill from caving in onto the sidewalk and onto the street. And me being, fifth grade boy, I decided instead of walking along the sidewalk, that I would step up and walk up along this concrete barrier. And I was doing fine until I got to the very, very top, which I mean was probably, I don't know, maybe like 10 feet up,
Hmm.
when my right foot slipped on dirt and I couldn't catch myself. And I tumbled over face first, 10 feet down onto the sidewalk
Oh
and
no.
landed on my cheek, landed on my stomach, landed on my legs, and all the air knocked out of me. And I'm like, I remember distinctly just sitting there trying to catch my breath, right? And I could feel like there's blood, there's a cut along the
Oh
side of my
no.
cheek. And I'm like, there's a sharp pain on my side. I don't know if I've cracked a rib or whatever, but I can't move in that moment.
Oh
And
no.
I give myself maybe like 15, 20 seconds just to try to like compose myself. And in this moment, and keep in mind, this was like lunchtime. It was a half day, our last day, right? So
Uh-huh.
it's like 12:30. In this moment, I start hearing laughter
Oh no.
from across the street. And when I get enough strength to kind of tip my head up, I look, and there's like two, three, four kids just dying, like gut busting, belly roll laughs,
Oh no.
pointing at me and just having a time of it.
Oh boy.
And I remember looking up and then looking down and setting my face back on the concrete again, I still can't really breathe. And
Oh
I'm trying
no.
real hard not to cry now,
Yeah.
right? Because the pain, there's like heat, like
Yeah.
internally there is heat. And the heat isn't necessarily just from the injuries that I know I've suffered, but it's this like intense anger. Not
Oh.
embarrassment,
Oh.
but anger,
Oh, you started turning villainous right there.
right? Like to that group of kids, I'm like, no, there's no sense in like trying to come over here and trying to like help me up.
Hmm.
And so in that moment, that is a moment where I felt if I could, if I could peel myself up from the sidewalk and Gumby my way over across the street and then blow myself back up, I would take you all on right now.
Oh, oh. Ooh, I wonder what those people are now, if they're
Yeah, no
aware
idea.
that they have this arch nemesis waiting for them somewhere.
Right. And I appreciate their lack of empathy because I'm sure that molded me in some very twisted direction starting right there and then.
Outstanding. All right. Well, Damien's here. Damien Alameda is here with me. I asked about villainy, but really we're talking about anti-heroes. And I'm presenting a bit of a thesis statement that we're going to unpack. But before we do that, Damien, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, before I do that though, let me just say number one, Vickie, you are looking fantastic.
Oh,
And
thank you.
it dawned on me that how long have we known each other at this
Oh,
point?
gosh. Before the pandemic, because we were in
Before
that
the
writing group.
pandemic.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
it's been a few years, right?
Hmm.
It dawned on me that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think this might be just the second time you and I have actually communicated in real time, face to face, since that very first time we met.
Oh,
And
you're
over those
right.
years, we've emailed, we've beta read for one another,
Hmm.
but I don't think we've actually ever talked.
Yeah, I
It's
know.
the first time, which
I
is
know it's
wild to
crazy.
me.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. So do you. I like the gray you've got going on. I also have it going on.
Got me.
It's like
It's
really in there, and it's
no,
something
but see,
around.
that's the sexy look these days,
Mhm.
right? That's the
Oh,
sexy
okay.
look. You got to throw in the little salt with the pepper.
Good.
Doesn't
Okay.
matter who
Well,
you are.
I feel better about that.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So,
So my
tell us
name,
what
my
you do.
name, yeah, my name's Damien Alameda. In the daytime, I read a lot. I write some. I started a booktube channel called the first, or it's called First Pages, and you can find it at the underscore first pages, where we basically it's a booktube channel. So we talk about books. Um, we tend to dive into like what makes first pages of some books better than others because I find that fascinating. I
Mhm.
talked to um, an author once, Miran Fader, actually, who just published a biography on Hakeem Olajuwon. She's a sports writer, and she told me that the first pages, first sentences, first paragraphs of books are always what kind of intrigue her the most. And I
Mhm.
kind of fell in love with that idea because it was the same for me. And so I kind of wanted to do a booktube channel kind of revolving around that. Although I don't know, after this talk about anti-heroes, we might have to rebrand it a little bit and kind of like narrow the focus to the anti-heroes and the avenging angels and such. But
Uh-huh.
so that's what I do during the day, and then at night I end up talking about sports on the local CBS station here in Tucson, Arizona.
So then, what is your favorite first page impression?
As in like my favorite first pages that I've ever read.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a tough one. But the first one that always comes to mind is Lee Child's Jack Reacher introduction, Killing Floor. I was arrested at Eno's Diner
Oh,
because it's
okay.
like
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
6 words and it sets a tone
Hmm.
and it raises questions and it brings up a mystery. I mean, imagine back in 97 when Child publishes this book. No one knows who Jack Reacher is, no one knows who Lee Child is. And the first sentence you read out of this brand new debut novel is I was arrested at Eno's Diner.
It kicks it right off. It goes straight into the action.
Right? It's
Yeah.
like, okay, who is this talking? Why were they arrested? What exactly did they do to get arrested? And
Mhm.
right there, you're hooked,
Yeah.
and you don't have a choice. You have to keep reading because you have
Yeah.
to find out what happens next.
I love that. Well, I appreciate the insight that you bring to first pages. I find when in my own writing, I try to be as intriguing with my first pages as well. And sometimes I feel like until I've got that first hook going, I don't feel like I have the rest of the story quite right yet. Do you feel the same
It's
way when you're writing?
hard. It's
Yeah.
hard
Yeah.
because I mean that's the whole reason why someone's going to want to care,
Hmm.
right? You got to hook them. And actually, I know you and I we've talked about this before. We've gone back and forth about this because uh, let's be honest, like we're impatient. That's our
Hmm.
nature, right? And so if you don't grab me within the first sentence, then I'm not gonna care that much to keep going. So you really have to. The exception there was the first Harry Potter, because I
Okay.
found like that the first chapter, the first few pages of Harry Potter in the Sorcerer's Stone, um, they were long. And
Mm,
as a kid, although I didn't read it as a kid, I read it as like an early 20 something. My eyes started to glaze over. It wasn't until like chapter 3, chapter 4, when stuff starts happening, that I actually wanted to keep reading.
mm,
But for the most part, yeah, you gotta hook the reader. So that's the biggest difficulty, at least for
yeah.
me, anyway.
All right. Well, Damien, I challenge you to a thought today, and I challenge our listeners. And we're going to be playing with some definitions here today. We're looking at antiheroes. And I know that antiheroes has its given definition, and so do some of the other things we're going to discuss, but I kind of want to question the antihero a little bit more. So the challenge that I'm presenting is an antihero a type of hero, or are we giving too much credit to a villain? So, with that being said, who are some of the most iconic antiheroes in fiction?
Iconic anti-heroes?
Mhm.
Well, I mean, shoot.
I'll go.
You could, there are a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also a lot who are considered anti-heroes who are not anti-heroes. Like
That are more villains.
when you gave me this topic, when we chose this topic, I went down like a rabbit hole, man.
Okay.
Because in my head, I had an idea of what I thought an anti-hero was to me, right? And then I started reading up on the technicalities of the definition, um, which some made sense, some didn't. And then taking that and applying it to certain characters and realizing, no, those characters, some of my favorite characters, some of what uh, our generation believed to be their favorite characters aren't exactly defined as what an anti-hero would be. So if you're talking about the most famous fictional anti-heroes, if we want to like narrow it down to the ones that we grew up with, right? If
Okay.
you look at the golden age of television, of specifically the last 20 years, what are some names of characters that stand out to you?
I would say, well, all the Star Wars stuff, but that goes further than 20 years. Harry Potter franchise. Um,
Would you
The
believe Harry
Matrix.
Potter? Would you believe Harry Potter is a hero or an anti-hero?
Ooh. I think that in the earlier books he feels like a hero, but I think that he goes through periods of time where he doesn't want to do it, or he's angry, or he's challenged, but he does it anyway. What
He
are your
uses
thoughts?
curses,
Yes, you're right. He does.
right? He goes against the grain, like he breaks the rules. He has this idea in his. I mean, it's he. Number one, let's be clear. He's an egotistical kid, right? Hermione makes that point very clearly numerous times. Like he's got a hero complex. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, in a lot of ways, he is selfish, especially when he's in, those teen years where just angry, right? And some of the actions he makes go against that archetypal hero role. He breaks the rules, he breaks and enters, he again uses curses. And so while he might start out as the hero with the best of intentions, he morphs and
Mm,
he darkens a little bit, right? And by the end of it, at least, by the end of his story, you could argue that for as heroic as his intentions are and were, the means he goes about getting to his goals and accomplishing and achieving what he needs to achieve, he he
yeah.
weaves. There's no straight line,
Yes.
right?
I think a really good example, and I'm forgetting which one it is. It's the one where everyone is telling him, like, I think Hermione is like, oh, which one was it? But they go to like the Ministry of Magic, and that's eventually Sirius Black dies. And if he had just listened to Hermione at some point, that entire thing could have been avoided.
Yeah.
I'm a little lost on my memory there, but you're right. There, it's interesting because from a reader's perspective, you're stuck in the head of Harry, So you naturally take on some of the biases that he has that inform his decisions. So you naturally want to root for him without being able to. Some people are much better at it than others.
Sure.
I'm a little bit more foggy about it, but like being able to really sit back and unpack the protagonist and ask yourself, is this the best thing that they could be doing?
The scene that you bring up, right? Harry is rushing to the scene because he is absolutely convinced that he needs to save Sirius, that something's going on, right?
Hmm.
And Hermione is trying to hold him back, cautioning him, saying, this is a trap, or at least potentially you could be walking into a trap and we're all going to go down.
Hmm.
But he's so caught up in his own head, which is a weakness, that he can't see the forest for the trees and makes his move. And ultimately, one thing leads to another, and Sirius goes bye bye.
Moving on to another character in Harry Potter that seems to be more publicly labeled as an antihero is Severus Snape. And that one I find interesting because it weaves back and forth. Well, he's a villain for a large portion of it from the eyes, especially from the eyes of a child. And you look at the behaviors that he's doing, and then he becomes his anti-hero when he was actually working for Dumbledore and he's undercover and it's for the well and all good being of the community. But then some people really question whether or not those are good values behind what he was doing and whether or not his motivations were truly altruistic. And so, is Severus Snape an anti-hero? Is he more of a villain? Are we giving too much credit to villains?
Okay, so this is where it got interesting, like going down that rabbit hole as far as defining what an anti-hero is.
Mhm.
And for me, like the characteristics that jump out most to me always revolve around motivation,
Okay.
right? I would argue that Snape is not an anti-hero. I would argue instead that Snape is an anti-villain, right?
Okay. Tell me more. I want to know what this
He's
is.
got and this once I explain this to you, okay, there's a chance that you're going to take that characterization and start applying it to different characters that again are initially labeled anti-hero
Hmm.
who really aren't. They're anti-villain. Okay.
Okay.
This is a guy who we are going to sympathize with. There are going to be moments in there where we are sympathizing with him because we learn more of his backstory. We know that he was picked on as a kid. We
Hmm.
know that just he lived a rough life, right? James Potter was his enemy,
Hmm.
right? We also know that he chose to join the Death Eaters,
Hmm.
right? And the result of that being ultimately the love of his life in his mind dies. So what does he do? He's filled with guilt, not necessarily because it's for the greater good, but because of the fact that his love was killed and he was a part of the reason why. Okay.
Hmm.
He treats Harry really poorly throughout the entire series, really throughout the entire series, even
Yeah.
when he dies, right? Like there is no glimpse of humility
Hmm.
or empathy or sympathy for Harry as a character. Why? Because that's Snape's nature. His nature is to be that pseudo bully. Doesn't matter if it's because he was bullied before and now he's just taking his, I guess, revenge out on the kid. That's just his nature, right? And so, as far as him being this anti hero, there is no like, he's not necessarily going for justice or like freedom or for the greater good. They're all like really specifically selfish reasons. And at the end of the day, he's still a bad guy.
Okay. So, is an anti-villain someone who is self-motivated and self-interested but happens to benefit others?
Could be. Takes Tony Soprano.
Okay.
Tony Soprano from The Sopranos, who is again lauded as one of like the most famous anti-heroes, right? This dude is a criminal, right? He is he's a bad guy at heart. He has sympathetic qualities that we as the viewer learn over time through his therapy sessions and such, but he's still willing to do bad things, right? he is what would be some would be considered to be like this rough hero character. Not an anti-hero, not an anti-villain, but this rough hero character where he's just a bad dude and it doesn't matter where he stands on the spectrum, chances are he's always going to act selfishly. Snape, on the other hand, is this anti-villain who ultimately he doesn't necessarily want to do the right thing. He's just kind of put in that corner and guilted into doing the right thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, would you see then Snape being a villain that had a redemption arc?
Yeah, he could.
Semantics. Okay, okay.
He
Okay.
could.
So then jumping over to Game of Thrones,
All right.
where it's super complicated. You got so many characters, and many times if we're reading them or if we're watching them, we're seeing them through the lens of other characters that see them as adversarial. Cersei Lannister. I mean, a woman we love to hate, right? But if you
Yeah.
look down to what she's doing, she's thinking about the well-being of her kids. Is she being just self-centered? Is she thinking more than just her? Or is she just seeing her kids an extension of her? Or she just doesn't care or give any licks about her, the people she actually rules over? Where does she land?
Okay. So you ask, okay, so given everything that you just said, right?
Uh-huh.
Ultimately, what does she care about?
Her
It's
family and kids.
power,
Yeah.
right? But ultimately, it's power because it's the family's power.
Hmm.
It's her children. It's her her brother, her lover,
Hmm.
her father, and obviously her little brother, not so much. But all that being said, I think she makes a good anti-hero, right?
Okay.
Um, but at the same time, it's like, what kind of redeeming qualities does she really possess? Like, what is she willing what good is she willing to do in the name of her family versus what bad is she willing to do in the name of her family?
I suppose if I was one of her kids, I'd be very thankful for her. However, they all met their doom. Maybe not necessarily because of her. She had that witch, premonition when she was younger, predicting the fact that all of her kids were going to die, and so it's like she's kind of fighting up against this deadline.
Right.
But I imagine if you put yourself in the position of her children and you saw her as like this unrelenting pit bull for you and your needs, then maybe she's more heroic than, say, Jon Snow, what he would think of her.
And it's all in the eye of the beholder,
Hmm.
right? Because yeah, her kids would love her because she goes up to bat for them, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, her mothering skills aren't the best. See her son. Um, but if you're a part of, you know, winter is coming,
Hmm.
Ned Stark and the Starks, they don't see that, right?
Yeah.
Because they have their own motivation, their own family to care for, and they see her as the antagonist because of everything that all the dominoes that fall in that direction.
Okay, before I move on to the next portion, is there a easy name to give that is like a really clear antihero that doesn't fall between all the shades of gray? Even though
Doesn't
antihero is a shade of gray, but you know what
Yeah,
I
I
mean.
mean, like let's be clear. Like there was a great definition that I saw that like the anti-hero has both the angel and the devil, but never really is convinced by either,
Oh,
right?
okay. Yeah.
So Batman. I've considered Batman an ideal anti-hero because of his motivations, right? He is a broken character. He is
Hmm.
a broken character. And everything he does as Batman, and really as Bruce Wayne as well, is a result of that brokenness, of losing his parents and the way he lost his parents.
Hmm. That's
Um,
true.
but there's a very clear line he is not willing to cross. He will not kill. In fact, he will help the police. He'll just do it his own way.
Hmm.
And so when I think anti-hero, and again, I think motivation, he's trying to clean up Gotham, right? But he's not going to clean up Gotham in the way that like Two-Face would want to clean up Gotham, which is bloodshed.
Hmm.
He's going to do it. He's going to break laws, but ultimately he's going to hand the bad guys over to the police for due justice.
And
And so because of that, anti-hero.
The police also probably don't appreciate the vigilanteism that he is using. I mean, of course, Commissioner Gordon has a partnership with him because it benefits them, but ultimately he's operating outside of the law. He's a lawless lawman,
He's a
according
lawless
to.
lawman, which, by the way, that was a great episode. Highly recommend that for you guys who
Oh,
haven't watched it.
thank you, Rob.
Um,
Rob did a great job.
oh, it's phenomenal. Um, again, so for me, for the anti-hero definition, it always comes down to motivation and what you are fighting for. If because anti-heroes by definition, again, are those selfish beings. They have, which is again part of their weakness, which is what doesn't make them heroic,
Hmm.
right? Uh, but at the end of the day, one, there are no lines, there are lines they will not cross, which is another reason why Cersei has a hard time falling into a definitive definition of antihero, because there are plenty of lines
Hmm.
she'll cross, right? Um, Batman, he's not going to kill anybody, right? Uh, I would go so far as to say, oh, and the other thing is, by the end of their story, rarely are they changed, the anti-hero.
Oh, okay.
So Batman is just, he's always Batman, right?
Hmm.
Except for like the Dark Knight Rises one. I guess he decides to retire and hand it
Yeah.
off to Robin. But for the most part, he's always Batman. Wolverine, Logan, who is another huge, like, favorite character of mine. Uh, Another broken soul, right? Another guy who does not care, who's going to have to be tugged in the direction of good, but will ultimately fight for good because he does see the bigger picture. He's a great anti-hero.
Hmm. Would you argue that it's the sympathetic nature of a character that makes him easier to qualify as any sort of hero?
No,
Okay. So you can be sympathetic
no.
towards a villain
Yeah.
and not and you have that gray area.
Um, the Penguin series
Okay.
that's running right now on HBO Max, right? Full disclaimer, I have not seen the series, but I've read plenty about it. And the writers, from what I have read and from what I understand, have done a great job of creating this character in Oz Cobb, who has very strong that moments of sympathy that bring the audience in to want to root for him, but then does actions that completely flip the table and remind you how cruel, how vicious, and how evil he really is. Right. So I think
Okay.
Tony Soprano is another example, right? Although he's that quote unquote rough hero type, but you can sympathize with the villain,
Yeah.
but it doesn't justify what they're doing.
You're
Like,
right. Daredevil, Kingpin, played by
yeah,
D'Onofrio.
yeah, Vincent
Yeah.
D'Onofrio.
Oh, phenomenal. I actually haven't seen past the first season, but I loved I loved the way they did Kingpin in the
Oh,
first
it's great.
season.
It was great because you understand exactly why he is the way he is.
Hmm.
You understand, uh, you know, the sympathies that you get for him don't necessarily make you want to root for him.
Hmm.
You just get him a little bit more, and the actions you understand the actions that he decides to take a little bit more. I just had another thought pop in my mind as far as another villain that does that. Well, actually, Voldemort,
Oh. Okay, sympathetic, yes, because he was an orphan
right?
and then was
Yeah,
mad about it.
and he
Like,
and
I
like
can't
I mean, he
remember.
gets thrown into an orphanage. Like his
Huh?
father is his father and
That's right.
his Muggle father and his witch mom. Um, Life does not play well with him at all, and so
Hmm.
what does he do? He turns and he becomes the pinnacle of villainy, right?
Yeah.
You get it, you understand, and there are moments in there where you're like, man, he had a really rough life. But I think the key here is we as humans always find ourselves on the precipice of choice.
Hmm.
You can choose which direction you want to go. You really can, right? At least that's what I would argue. Some choose to go for good, some choose to go for evil. And the way they get there might lend an empathetic ear, but at the end of the day, they still choose evil or they still choose good. And so I think that's one line I think you could draw down and kind of break and figure out who's who and where and why.
That's a good segue then into the next portion, which is comparing the antihero to the hero's journey. Because you talked a lot about deviations, right? There's deviations that
Yeah.
happen. So let's before we talk about the antihero, let's establish the hero's journey. So the hero's journey, I mean, there's you can list off all the different steps, but I narrowed it down to three stages, right? You depart and you get initiated into an unfamiliar world, overcoming obstacles, encountering friends and foes, and then ultimately the return after your accomplishment. How does the anti-hero experience vary or completely contrast from this?
Okay, so I saw another article that kind of broke this down pretty convincingly. And the first thing was the anti-hero, when it comes to that call to action,
Hmm.
is not initially going to take that call to action.
Okay.
Like the anti-hero is going to have to be pushed in that direction for whatever reason and however, right? Um,
Like their family's killed, maybe kind of persuasion.
yeah. Or just like, you know, you go back to the golden days of the private eye, neo-noir, Chinatown. Jack Gitz comes in. A woman wants him to investigate something with her husband, and he refuses. He doesn't want to do it, right? Only until later he's convinced that, oh, maybe I should look into this, and then he goes about his way. Any protagonist, and I think that's the other key. It's like the anti-hero has to be, or the hero has to be the protagonist of the story. Um, if they have to be convinced to go on the journey, that might be a sign that they're more anti-hero than hero.
I like that.
Does that make like what do you
Yeah.
think about that?
No, I do. I like that because it's easy to assign a moral foundation to the hero that informs why they choose to take the challenge, right? Because that it's Hercules. Think of Hercules, like these well-being figures that are supposed to be kind of role models to us. And it's kind of more nuanced when somebody doesn't have that very black and white foundational support
Right.
structure and they have to be otherwise convinced to go on the journey.
So now we've got the anti-hero on the journey.
Mhm.
Another difference between the hero and the anti-hero, again, motivation. Like the hero's going off to do XYZ because it's for maybe for the greater good or for the good of something. Whereas the anti-hero is going to go off and go through this journey because of inherently more selfish reasons,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, maybe,
Like,
okay, the benefit is I save the kingdom, but what I really want is to murder a specific person. General example.
or, or they're going to get paid,
Mm.
right?
Hmm.
Like they need the money, or they're going to get, if I'm going to do this, it's going to convince the other character to fall in love with me somehow.
Hmm.
Either way, it's not an altruistic motivation. They're going out there because they're doing it for selfish reasons, right? And then I think ultimately, um, the hero, the hero, one way or another, is going to change over the course of the
Hmm.
story, right? Like that's the classic prototype. Start one way, and by the end of the story, you have experienced something and changed your ways, changed your mind, changed the way you look at the world in one way or another.
Hmm.
The anti-hero is not going to do that. The anti-hero, like I said, mentioned earlier, like Batman's always going to be Batman,
Yeah.
right? Wolverine is inherently Wolverine. Logan is Logan. Like it, he's not going to change. Rarely, I shouldn't say not. Rarely does the anti-hero go through a process of change. Um, John Wick. John Wick is John Wick, right? Uh, he is what he is. He is a killing machine. He goes out and takes out all the bad guys in the first film. Why? For a selfish reason. They killed his dog, right? And who gave him his dog? His wife, who died. He's seeking revenge, right?
Hmm.
But also because that's just who he is. That's just what he does. And by the end of the film, it's not like he has experienced this epiphany of what it means to be good. He's just accomplished his goal, which is get revenge on his dog.
I think betrayal is a big part of it too, because several times and I've seen the first movie and pockets of the subsequent movies where you think he's got an ally, and then sure enough, some sort of betrayal happens. And that was another departure that I found from the hero journey is rather than having a positive mentorship, for example, Star Wars, Luke Skywalker and oh my God, Obi-Wan, being his positive mentor. And of course, the mentor dies, and that allows the hero to fulfill his true destiny. But in the case of the antihero, you're coming across people that you maybe trust, but they end up betraying you. And it further pushes the foundation of the antihero's character to kind of continue to have a pessimistic outlook on things, or at least not the hope that a hero would have, which could further inform why there isn't that guaranteed transformation at the end.
And ultimately, the anti-hero could fail,
Mm.
right? And it wouldn't make any difference, right? Um, the hero is going to win one way or another. The hero is going to win. Uh, Rocky, at the end of the first film, loses the match, but proves everything to himself, right? Proves that he could step in the ring, take on Apollo, and last,
Hmm.
right? That's a huge character builder. Um, you could argue at the end of the first film, Deadpool hasn't changed at all, hasn't learned anything, similarly, right? There is no epiphany of anything. He's just still Deadpool. He's still a mercenary with a mouth, with two katanas and a messed up face,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
That
Um,
it's an interesting characteristic to point out because then my next idea is if you were to take a turn for the worst, is that the villain's origin story? So let's analyze antiheroes against villains. On the spectrum between good and evil, where does the antihero fall? Can they ever be truly good? Or are they villains who just happen to like not have turned yet? And an example I threw out there was the Anakin Skywalker to Darth Vader path. Big question, but what are your thoughts on all that?
well, that's interesting that Anakin Skywalker it's a Darth Vader because what does Darth Vader ultimately do in the end? He like
He redeems himself,
he redeems himself. Um,
but he's a villain ultimately. That's how he's
as
introduced to us.
yeah, right. Uh, that's an interesting question. So, so if ultimately, I don't ever really think that if the nature of the anti-hero is can the anti-hero be redeemed?
I imagine the antihero would have to do a complete change to a villainous mindset, maybe in order to require redemption, or maybe you could just redeem yourself from the mildly gray perspective of an antihero versus a hero.
But see, if and I think the thing would be is that if the anti-hero is going to be redeemed, the anti-hero becomes a hero and
Ah,
is no longer the anti-hero,
can't have
right?
that.
What's that?
Can't have that if you want them to stay in the anti-hero category.
No. And okay, Tony Stark, I think, would fall into this category. Because in the beginning, in Iron Man 1, that dude is an anti hero. He
Mhm.
is, for all intents and purposes, a selfish jerk, right? High on life, billionaire, genius, very narcissistic, very incredibly arrogant. And then, as not even just in Iron Man 1, but over the course of the entire Avengers Endgame saga, you see him change into a hero. Because by the end of it, when he snaps his fingers,
Yeah.
he's doing it knowing that he's going to sacrifice himself for the greater good. And I think that might be the other underlying characteristic sacrificing yourself for the greater good,
Mm.
sacrificing yourself, sacrificing anything about you for the greater good.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and so he goes from an anti hero to a hero. Conversely, Walter White, Breaking Bad,
Hmm.
he goes from and this is not me this I read this in a paper um and actually on YouTube too. uh Starts out as an anti-hero, He's the opposite of Tony. Tony is arrogant, narcissistic, rich. Walter White is, again, a broken individual, right? Living in basically his own personal hell, teaching chemistry. He once upon a time was partners in a company that ultimately did not want him to be a part of and went on to make millions, billions. And on top of all that, he's diagnosed with lung cancer.
Hmm.
Very easy to sympathize with him, right? And in fact, in the initial few episodes of Breaking Bad, all the bad things he does, um, including like, I mean, people die at his hand, but you can kind of step away from that because he's still Walt. He hasn't completely formed into Heisenberg yet. He's still that chemistry teacher trying to get the kids in the back of the room to pay attention to him.
Hmm.
But then a switch turns, right? Uh, and comes Heisenberg, and he becomes that cold, calculated monster that not necessarily villain, because again, the villain is not the protagonist of the story, but that rough hero that Tony Soprano is. He morphs into that rough hero archetype where his nature now, he's just a bad guy. And even when it seems like he's redeeming himself at the very end, when he comes to terms with all of the chaos and hell that he has created as a result of his own decision making, I don't think, and I don't think the viewers think, that he would ever really change anything.
Mm.
And so when he dies, he puts that W up on that lab because that's the only thing he ever really cared about, that lab and being that powerful. And so he morphs from the anti-hero to, again, that rough hero archetype. Um, and it doesn't matter how many times he says he's sorry to Skyler. The reality is it's just him. And if he were
Hmm.
to do it all over again, he absolutely would. And
Yeah.
I think if Tony Stark were to do it all over again, there are plenty of things he would change.
Oh, okay. That's a good point because he grew. He ultimately
Yeah.
grew from his experience. What I love about the last 20 years of TV and storytelling is and I've mentioned this before in previous episodes, is we went from cookie cutter kind of cartoony portrayals of villainy and heroes to really getting nuanced. And for me, Breaking Bad was one of those first exposures to this gray character. Another one was Mad Men, right? You have Don Draper, who is supposed to be seen as this like amazing guy, but he treats his family kind of poorly and he's questionable values. And so, as these shows have been rolling out, they're immensely popular. So, why do you think that is? Why do we love antiheroes?
Because they're just so interesting.
Hmm.
Because we see ourselves much more in them, or see what we want to see in ourselves much more in them than your cookie cutter hero. I mean, tell me who is more interesting off the top, Steve Rogers or Tony Stark?
Oh,
Me?
Tony Stark.
Tony Stark.
I,
But
I was
why?
just watching. I was rewatching Avengers Endgame actually, and kind of I'm always entertained when Tony Stark comes on the screen compared
Exactly.
to Captain Rogers.
And why?
He's sassy, he's sarcastic, he's kind of self-deprecating. He's the kind of the cheeky kind of acknowledgement to the audience that this is all kind of fantastical but fun. Whereas Steve Rogers is just really formal and just, military and all that stuff.
He's the Boy Scout,
Hmm.
and Tony is the rebel. And at least for me, and I can only speak for myself, I love the rebellious nature of characters.
Hmm.
Um, because again, that's just much more fun. If I'm going to go on a journey, I want to go on a journey with someone who, if they're stuck in a corner, is going to break the rules in order to get out because that's the only way they're going to get out. Right.
Hmm.
It's just more entertaining to me. And I think also um, they're more realistic. Right.
Yeah.
Like anti-heroes, again, they have serious issues. They have moral quandaries. They have things about themselves that maybe they just don't like. They just don't know how to change. And my gosh, that sounds a lot like humanity in a lot of ways. So for those characters. And I think that's an interesting point too. It's because, uh, generationally, like what types of heroes do generations gravitate towards? We are, our generation now maybe is a little bit more self-reflective,
Hmm.
mental health,
Yeah.
physical health, financial health, all
I mean,
that.
we're bored of Superman.
Right.
We find him to be uninteresting and we gravitate towards the more colorful characters.
And that being said, when Superman and Captain America were introduced, 30s, 40s, there was a definitive line between who were the bad guys and who were the good guys, right? And so it made sense because Captain America fighting Nazis, that was the world.
Hmm.
That was real life, right? Uh, and so for them, it made sense to find a hero that was just a supreme bad ass who could just like take people out, but still have that really strong moral code,
Hmm.
right? Now we live in a much more grayish society in terms of that ambiguity. And that's just a reflection of real life in these characters.
So let me ask a couple of ethical questions. First one, should the antihero be held accountable for their morally questionable actions in the same way that we expect the villains to be?
Held accountable, probably. Will that do anything to change them? Probably not. I mean, right?
Yeah,
Like you kill somebody in the name of revenge. It doesn't matter how much devastation that victim has brought in your life. You still kill the person. So
true.
you should probably be held accountable to that, right? And if you're not, hey, we as an audience are cheering. Like you got away with it. Good job. Good for you, right? And if
I
you
think
are, and if you are, the audience is like, well, you know what? You got to face the music, but at the same time, good job.
the next time I meet somebody or talk to somebody where they tell me they've changed as a result of having a lesson learned, I'm going to be like, how heroic of you.
But it's a
Oh,
fair point, right?
yeah, yeah.
I mean, yeah,
Do anti-heroes need to be successful in their endeavors for audiences to find them compelling? What happens when they fail?
I think it makes it more compelling when
Oh,
they fail
okay.
because, I mean, especially when they get in their own way of things,
Hmm.
right? Because it's just more interesting and because we fail. Like the hero will experience challenges, but ultimately somehow accomplish the goal. We know that going in, right? The anti-hero, we have no idea what's going to happen. But because of the nature of that character, it's going to be really entertaining and interesting to see how he or she navigates those waters. And if he or she doesn't end up accomplishing the goal, it was still a fun ride,
Yeah.
you know?
Oh, this conversation's inspiring me because I'm currently drafting out a story right now, and the more we're talking about it, I'm like, my main character's an anti-hero. And
Yeah.
it's everything you're mentioning about, even if it doesn't pan out, it was still a wild ride. That's such
Yeah.
a great way to think about it. Like, because so many times we think, how do they succeed in the end? Well, what if they don't? But let's make it really fun to get
Right.
from the beginning to the end.
Right. And really, I mean, that's life, right? Like
Hmm.
we probably fail more times than we succeed. Um, and all that does, if you fail that once, hey, write book two and see if you can do it again.
Hmm. All right. Now I have a game plan for you, and I did not tell you the details of this game ahead of time, so I'm kind of putting you on the spot here. But I
Should I
trust
be
you can
worried?
handle it. No, I think you've already demonstrated they're very knowledgeable about this. So this is more fun. Okay, now that we've distinguished anti-heroes and villains and anti-villains, I'm gonna list a famous villain, or at least a villain that the interwebs agrees is a villain, and see how if you can quickly spin their story to better suit an anti-hero role. Okay. All right. The first one I'm going to say that you've actually mentioned yourself. It is the Joker.
The Joker. Well, okay, so he is interesting, right? Because depending on his storyline, it's it could be very easy to sympathize with him. because of uh you know, he gets in deep with the mob. Mob comes in, takes out his wife, throws him in a vat of acid, and as a result becomes the Joker. Now you want to turn him into an anti-hero. Here's
Hmm.
what happens.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
maybe he goes crazy, but his crazy doesn't throw him down the road of chaos. Instead, he takes that craziness and redirects it and goes after specifically those who committed atrocities against his family, him and his wife. So it's not as if he's going to watch Gotham City burn
Hmm.
because he's just fed up with everything and because it's fun for him. No, no. He's going to watch his specific adversaries burn, and he's going to do it brutally, right? He is going to break the laws, but ultimately, he's going to go after the bad guys who hurt him and not Gotham City as a whole.
And maybe he succeeds at the end and nothing will change about him, right? Because he will still be in that mindset.
Because getting thrown in the acid and getting his wife taken out have completely changed him and turned him. And he's no longer the person he was before, right? There's your change.
Uh-huh.
Now he is a guy who is just going to, because ultimately there is no good. He finds no good with the people who attacked him. So he's going to wipe them out.
All right. Impressive, impressive. Okay, this next one. Hannibal Lecter. Does he only eat the people that harmed him?
Hannibal Lecter. Okay, okay. Let's change his story a little bit, right?
Okay.
So eats people because that's what he does,
Yeah.
right?
And he'll never
But
change.
and he'll never change. But what you just intimated, like, who does he eat? Who does he eat specifically? He has these urges that he can kind of contain and redirect.
Oh, okay.
And
So
let's
he only
say,
eats serial killers. No, sorry. Go ahead.
okay, well, maybe he's Dexter, right? Maybe he's Dexter. Um, but I think there's a difference between Dexter being an anti-hero and what we could turn Lecter into.
Okay.
Because uh let's say Starling got hurt by someone, right? And like seriously hurt. And we know that Lecter cares about Clarice. So what he does is he's going to make it his mission to take revenge on the person or group of people who hurt Clarice Starling. And the way he's going to do that is by befriending somebody and inviting them all over for a dinner party, right?
Uh-huh.
Drugging the food, having them incapacitated, and basically each of them watch as he cuts open their skull, peels it back, and starts eating their
Dang.
brains.
Dang, Damien.
But why is he doing it? Right?
Hmm.
He's doing it because they hurt someone he was very close to, right? And here's the better part about it, right? Let's say the people who hurt Starling were like higher ups, like real higher ups, like people in power who have abused their power, right? So like they're corrupt,
Hmm. Okay.
like running the gambit of corruption. This is how. So really, he's not just getting revenge for Starling, but he's getting revenge on behalf of all the people that these people have hurt, and there are countless. It's just the means he does it are a little grotesque.
Oh, wow. I'm impressed. I'm impressed. You're on the fly thinking at the detail that you're thinking. Great job. Okay, last and final one. Or I should say third and final one. Last and final is the same thing. Agent Smith from The Matrix.
So here's the tough part about Agent Smith. The dude's got a point,
Okay, yes, yes. And
right?
what is that point?
Human beings are a cancer.
was gonna say we suck.
Yeah, I mean that's basically it. I think he says it that I think he says that much. Like
Yeah.
we are a cancer. We are a virus that destroy everything. Um, and so
Change the POV of the reader.
you got to, right? Like
Yeah.
he is technically also a virus within the program,
Yeah.
right? So what you got to do is got to build it up a little bit. So what did we as human beings do to bring him personally to that point? It's not necessarily something that he has observed, but something that he has felt within himself as a result of things that human beings have done.
Hmm.
So let's say he had like a nice little virus family,
Okay.
right? And the human beings came around, saw the virus, and was like, hey, that virus is infecting other things. We need to make sure that that virus ends, take it out of the system so that we can keep on keeping on. And let's say that's what they do. They X out, they I don't know, what is
They delete.
a solid virus, fighting
They
software.
get yeah, they get an antivirus.
An antivirus becomes the anti-hero, right? And now he's just like, nah, can't do this. But it's even more than that, because as the humans have taken out his family, they have grown and repopulated so that no more viruses can come about and prosperously within the matrix. And what is he going to do about that? He's not going to destroy them all, but he's going to have to make everybody accountable for him. He's not going to like turn them into slaves. He's not going to take them out. Um, but he is going to have to stop it. And the way he's going to stop it is he's going to peel back the curtain on the true motives as to why the human beings are doing what they're doing. Because let's just imagine that within this matrix, there is supposed to be a peaceful coexistence between all of these beings. Well, the humans don't want that. They don't want
Mhm.
peace.
No.
They want to be the ultimate on the throne in power. And Agent Smith recognizes their true motivations. So it's not just about him and his family. It's something else entirely. It's something more devious. And so he's going to go after them, the bad guys, the true
Ah,
bad guys, the cancer, the humans, and show everybody, like, and not even just the humans, like the specific, uh,
humans in power?
yeah, humans in power,
Yeah. It's always the human
right?
those humans in power. It's always the humans in power.
Always a human's power to show the others in the matrix, right?
Yeah.
That look, you guys are all blind. You guys are all blind to what these people are doing. They're ruining you. Let me peel back the curtain, and I'm going to do it in nefarious ways, for sure. Like it's going to be like one of them and like a billion of me, and we're going to fight it out with sticks and stuff. But ultimately, you're going to learn that the people that you trust do not deserve your trust.
Hmm. Okay. Peeling back the layers, exposing the truth. All right. Very impressive work, Damien. So now my final question is, now that you've turned these traditional legacy villains into antiheroes, which way do you prefer them? Are they better as villains? Are they better as antiheroes? Do they each have their place? What are your thoughts?
Um, that's a complicated question.
I know. Yeah, I just thought of that too. And my thought was, I think that it can be complicated depending on the story you're trying to tell because there's only so much nuance and complexity you can fit in a story, and you need your
Right,
characters to serve specific roles.
right, right.
So, depending on who they're bouncing off of, I don't
I
know. What
think
do you?
that, and I think that's the story. It's the story. It just
Mhm.
depends on the story. Because some of my favorite anti-heroes do just very jacked up things, and I would never want them to change at all. I would never want the person. One of my favorite anti-heroes is Lisbeth Salander
Okay.
from The
Yes.
Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
Hmm.
An incredibly easy character to sympathize with because of everything that she's forced into as the result of the decisions of others, right? And
Hmm.
only when she learns how to take the power back for herself does she start making moves. But the only way she does do that is through her intelligence and also So that comes within the form of like hacking
Hmm.
and becoming this amazing hacker, and her just do not care if you mess with me. I'm going to make sure you do not mess with me ever again. Right?
Hmm.
She is a broken character, a very angry character, a very vengeful character, um, and does some very bad things. But she also has a heart. Like she knows where the line is drawn. Sometimes she'll choose the darker side of that line, but her heart really does remain on the better side of the line of like helping others. That's the only reason why she works for the company she works for. She can dive into, she can hack all of these bigwigs and figure out how they're basically screwing over the little people and then
Hmm.
uncover it for the masses. I don't want her to change. I would love it if she like found happiness, but if she found happiness, that would totally diminish everything that's cool about her,
All
right?
right. Antiheroes are cool. That's
Yes, I
a
think
good way
that's
to
the
put it.
bottom line.
There
Yep.
you go. All right, Damien, I have really enjoyed this conversation. I hope our listeners have too. Do you have, before I finish this, do you have any final words or any promotion that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Um, Let me just say this much, right? This podcast is phenomenal. And it might seem as if I'm a little biased because, again, we're friends and I've known you for a long time, but I don't just say that loosely. I mean, this podcast for aspiring writers, for published authors, for folks who just enjoy books and tropes and what makes certain tropes work and just the fineries of the process. I cannot tell you how proud I am of you for developing this podcast into what it has become because it is I mean, I learn something every time I listen. I learned, and for those of you who haven't watched, go back to the spicy smutty podcast we did.
Spice and everything nice, yes.
I didn't know what nodding was.
I still haven't looked it up.
I did. I looked it up, and we can talk about that off camera. So you learn something. My point is, you learn something every time you watch one of these podcasts. I don't know if anybody learned anything off of today's podcast,
Oh,
but
I bet they
the
did.
other subsequent episodes, trust me, folks, you will learn stuff. I am just so like honored to be on this thing, and it's just so much fun. And what you've done is incredible. Again, I run a little YouTube channel, and I stress little because it is very little. First pages on YouTube. If you want to check it out, it is at the underscore first pages, THE underscore FIRSTPAGES. And yeah, I look forward to doing more of these because I had a blast.
That's right. And you're coming back in a couple months to talk about Avenging Angels.
Oh, see,
So
we're gonna weave and tie in things. Oh,
there you
it's
go.
good stuff.
Oh, good stuff. All right. Well, thank you so much, Damien, for joining me today. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We'll be back next week, and I'll talk to y'all later. Bye.